Hello and welcome to another episode of the ProPeace Report. I'm Kobi, the host today, and we'll be interviewing Alex Suarez. So Alex Suarez is an American from Florida who was invited by the Venezuelan government to be an election companion at the most recent election that happened last month. And so we'll talk about the election, his experience there, the difference between an election companion and an election observer, and the case of Alex Saab as well. So without further ado, here is Alex Suarez. How are you doing today, man?
Good, brother. I wanted to show, first off, you mind if we go into the Alex Saab portion first, and then I can talk about the elections?
Yeah, we can talk about it first a little bit. So what do you want to say about the case of Alex Saab?
Literally, the left just won an election in Honduras. The wife, Xiomara Castro de Zelaya, the wife of Manuel Zelaya, who was deposed during the Obama administration in Honduras, who was the progressive president then, she won. And literally there was Venezuelans as international observers after I left Venezuela that were flying up to Honduras with this book, just as I had this book on the plane. But unfortunately, they weren't U.S. citizens, so they were going through the United States. They were harassed by U.S. authorities for having this book and deported back to Venezuela. That's how they want to silence people. That's how they tried to rig it against Xiomara Castro de Zelaya. But she had so much support that she still won by overwhelming numbers. This book is not even been translated yet. It's one of the few copies, but go ahead.
I was going to say, just for people who don't know, because I want to dumb it down to the lowest level possible so people can actually understand the case, because I'm sure some people watching might not. And so what is going on with Alex Saab, and why is this case so important?
So this gentleman is just as important as Assange, okay? He's a political prisoner of the U.S. empire. This book in Spanish is Cartas desde su secuestro, which literally means letters from his kidnapping. And so these were letters that were able to be smugged out while he was being tortured at the behest of U.S. authorities on Cape Verde Island. Now, there is a program in Venezuela from years back that's similar to food stamps here. It's called the CLAP program, Programa de CLAP. And there was 6 million Venezuelans that were able to be prevented from starvation because of these vicious U.S. imposed primarily sanctions on the country, on the people. So 6 million of them were fed in great part because of Alex Saab. I mean, this guy, if anything, deserves Nobel Peace Prize. But he used his business, and his diplomatic status, because he's been a diplomat in Venezuela since 2018. The courts in Miami now, where they extradite him, are claiming, I was in Miami the day at his arraignment before I went to Venezuela. They're claiming that he's not a real diplomat. He's been recognized as a diplomat. I knew about his diplomatic status since 2018. And he was captured during the Trump regime in June of 2020 en route on a humanitarian diplomatic mission to the Middle East, to Iran. And while he was on the way there, he had to make a stopover to fill his plane with gas in Cape Verde. And that's when, without even a extradition order from Interpol, they produced another order like the next day after they captured him with the wrong name. It wasn't even the same guy. But, obviously it was U.S. pressure from Trump that called the Cape Verdean authorities. And they arrested him and started to torture him at their behest. And now, since Biden's taken over, they actually extradited Saab to Miami the day before the new president, who was just about to release him, took over Cape Verde. 90% of the Cape Verdeans said they were against Alex Saab being held there. They wanted him freed. And they had a presidential election, and the president, they lost because they saw him as how he is, a puppet of the U.S. The new guy promised to release Alex Saab the day before he was inaugurated. They deported him to Miami.
And so let's explain it from the perspective of somebody who doesn't know about his case, because I've been doing a little bit of research. I don't know everything because, I understand how it involves the left because, this is a guy with a diplomatic status. This is a guy that he was trying to help as I understand it, he was trying to help the Venezuelan government avoid sanctions so that they could still continue getting goods and medicines and other things into the country. But, I'm sure some leftists, when they hear the story, they might think, oh, well, he's like a really rich businessman. Why should the left be defending a really rich businessman? And so just explain from your perspective, how does that why is this case so important, even to people who think that way?
Well, let me give you his background. And by the way, he's being punished for defying U.S. empire, defying U.S. sanctions. That's clear. He's being made an example of, which puts all of diplomacy at risk, because diplomatic immunity and the Vienna Convention is out the door. You remember I was at the Venezuelan embassy in 2019. We said the same thing when U.S. authorities invaded that embassy in Washington. We said this is a violation of the Vienna Convention. What's going to happen next? And then what happened next was the next year when they kidnapped Assange. I'm sorry, when they kidnapped Alex Saab. Assange is also kidnapped. Yeah. But anyways, his background, let me tell you about his background. So he was born in the Caribbean of Venezuela in a town, in the Caribbean of neighboring Colombia in a town called Barranquilla. And his parents were from the Middle East. His father was a Palestinian refugee that lived in Lebanon. His mother was Lebanese, and they had both migrated to Colombia, where Alex Saab was born. And so his family were leftists, and they, had issues being in Colombia because, as you know, there's paramilitary there, there's right-wing regime there that's fully U.S. backed. So they ended up fleeing to Venezuela in the early 2000s. And so Alex Saab spent a great deal of his life in Venezuela, was eventually given Venezuelan citizenship, started a legitimate business in Venezuela, and then, out of his support for the Chavista government and for the Bolivarian Revolution there, was granted diplomatic status so he could use his ties in the Middle East and outlying countries with Venezuela to help fight U.S. sanctions. And so,
and I think that's so important. The fact that he has diplomatic status and they still ended up arresting him and extraditing him anyway, like, that's a big deal. Like, I remember connecting it to the Julian Assange case. I remember that there were efforts to get Julian Assange diplomatic status so that he could leave the embassy without being arrested. And I can't remember exactly what happened. I think it didn't end up happening.
No, what ended up happening is Assange is very principled. So when he was offered Russian residency or Russian diplomatic status, so they could, extract him and bring him to Russia, where Snowden is, so they figured, well, Putin was friendly with Snowden, maybe he'll be friendly with Assange. So there was negotiations going on. There was a Russian offer, which he rejected because he said, I want to be the diplomat of any state.
It was an Ecuadorian offer too, though, I thought. And I thought that one he genuinely wanted.
I think they were going to hire him as a liaison, a diplomatic liaison between the Ecuadorian and the Russian government. He was given Ecuadorian citizenship at one point, but he was going to go to Russia or maybe to Ecuador via Russia. But he ended up rejecting that. He didn't reject the Ecuadorian citizenship or, of course, the Ecuadorian asylum. He rejected the liaison diplomatic status that they were offering him now that I recall, because he felt like that was against his principles. But now the CIA, it's been revealed that, and they're in charge of where he's held if he's extradited to the United States. Not to get too off topic, but they're the ones that decide. And so the CIA, we know now that they were planning to kidnap him if the Russians had come to London to pick him up, or even shoot the tires of a plane. It's just insanity. This lawlessness of the U.S. empire out of control, like we've never seen. And so Alex Saab, he was defying U.S. empire successfully. He was saving millions of lives. And so there was originally 8 charges against him. Now, here's the big, and my comrades in Venezuela agree, here's the big lie that the Cape Verdean government is saying now. The Cape Verdeans are like, oh, we used our influence with the U.S. to get 7 of the 8 charges dropped on the condition that he would be extradited. Who could believe such a thing? The little island of Cape Verde, which is basically a vassal state of the United States, had the authority to make such a deal. If the British, who want to keep Assange in limbo, in cahoots with the United States, wants to drive Assange mad, if the British were much more powerful than the Cape Verdeans, had influence over the U.S., maybe they would give in and let Assange go. But no, instead they're working in cahoots with the United States. So if the British can't even do that, what are you talking about, the Cape Verdeans? So the Cape Verdeans, the reason why their government's saying this is because they don't want to lose their allies, Russia and China. You see, they want to play both sides, and they know that Russia and China are advocates of Saab, and that they're friendly with Maduro and his government. And so the truth is, the reason why 78 charges were dropped, Kobi, is because there's no evidence.
They threw the book at him, basically.
What's that?
They threw the book at him, basically, to get him. They were looking for anything and everything.
It's racism.
Like how they've charged Assange with 18 different things.
Let me explain something. So I think it's racism because one of the charges was drug trafficking, which was completely baseless. And I think what they were planning to do was to try to keep that charge originally so that, try to find dirt on him and then, hold that over his head and then get jurors in Miami because, Miami has a lot of right-wing exiles that would not like Saab anyways. But to try to get, maybe some white racist jurors that thought, well, of course, he's Colombian kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
So that was just a racist thing. But yeah, that was one of the charges. So the only one that stuck is not even money laundering. People say it's money laundering. No, it's not even that. The only one that stuck is conspiring to money launder. Mm-hmm. So that's a very vague charge. It's a political charge. You're not supposed to extract international law over politics. Huh?
It makes sense why he would want to in this situation, because when you think about it from the very beginning, the sanctions against the Venezuelan government are unjust. Just initially, they're unjust, preventing Venezuela from freely associating with other countries.
By the way, last time I was here, Kobi, I told you it was 40,000 that the UN confirmed were killed by U.S. sanctions in Venezuela. The new numbers are now 100,000, just so you know. But they're doing incredible to fight it, making their own factories that I saw with my own eyes. But we'll get into that later. But 100,000 people we're talking about.
Yeah, and the thing is, they use their oil company, their nationalized oil company, to provide social services for people. They have democratic elections, And the thing is, it's ironic for the U.S., who we have money in politics. We only have 2 political parties. We don't even have all of the opposition parties that they have in Venezuela. Their turnout in the most recent election was 43% or so. A U.S. midterm election is usually around the same amount. And it's I get it. No country's perfect, right? There must be some sort of flaw in the system.
Also, you need to realize in your comparison right there that most Americans own a car. In Venezuela, the government invests with the few resources that they have in infrastructure, in public transportation. And I saw with my own eyes a map of even in the countryside, even in the rural areas of the country, they have a lot of more voting centers or voting booths than we would here in the United States in areas like that. So they make it very accessible. So to say, well, we're about the same midterms as them, but it's for them, it would be really hard because not everybody has a car. But the government's
my own point, not that they're
make it more accessible.
My point is not that they're the same. My point is just that there's no good reason for us to call them undemocratic. Because when you look at us and you look at them, they have elections, we have elections. Ours have way more money in them from what I can tell. And so it's I just don't understand. And it's all because of their socialist government. We don't like the fact that they have socialism. The opposition loses in their elections. So it's they don't have a mandate to say, oh yeah, we're going to sanction this government until it falls down. Because it's well, but why would you do that? Why wouldn't you do that to Colombia, for example? Why wouldn't you do that to, I don't know, any U.S. ally who has some sort of flaw in their process? We only
if you're a U.S. ally, it almost guarantees. If you're a U.S. ally, it almost guarantees you're going to be a human rights abuser. The closest U.S. allies are Colombia and Saudi Arabia, the biggest human rights abusers.
Yeah, so we never call them out on that.
When they're talking about human rights in Venezuela, it's a joke. There's no comparison to Colombia and the fascist, thugs and the paramilitaries that are killing people every day, that killed Saab's, that persecuted Saab's family and any family that's a leftist or that's left leaning. That's just the reality. But let me tell you something else. So, I'm in grad school here at UNF. And so one of my classes was on modern Germany. And the professor is clearly an admirer of Angela Merkel, right? So he always rants and raves about her, that one of the greatest chancellors in Germany's history. And she was elected 4 times and she was this amount of time in power. And it's one of these days, I'm just going to ask him, excuse me, why does nobody call her a dictator?
Yeah. Right, because she was in office for 16 years or so.
Way longer than Maduro's ever. Way longer than Maduro's been in power. And so
they'll use the same argument against Ortega in Nicaragua, saying, oh, he's been in office all of these years, so he must be a dictator. But he won the elections there. And Angela Merkel in Germany won the elections there to be in office that long.
Let me explain my opinion why people say that. Number one, she's white. Number two, she doesn't have an abundance of oil. So, they want to impose their puppet down there, Guaido, who never even ran for president. Literally while I was in forums in Venezuela and somebody would mention, they're claiming Guaido's president. Every time they say that, I start breaking out in laughter because the guy's a joke. He can't even show his face in Venezuela. If he does, he's heavily guarded.
You would think
walks at him. They hate him.
You would think if what they were saying about Guaido were true, if he was really the rightful president of Venezuela, you would think that his party would have won these most recent elections, right? Because they stopped boycotting.
Well, he's not even part of his party.
They officially participated in the election. They still lost.
Do you know that his own party threw him out?
Really?
It's been like a year. He's not been a part of his own party. They have a new guy in there that replaced him. I forget his name, but it was like a year ago. So he's not part of the National Assembly anymore, nor is his party. But he was thrown out of his own party before his party was voted out of the National Assembly. So his party had to distance themselves from him to survive politically, and they still didn't survive politically. So Guaido is a joke. So this is the reality they're facing. He was a puppet that was invented by Trump. He was educated at George Washington University, so he was American educated, Guaido, and he was invented by Trump and is being propped up by Biden. So it proves when it comes to empire, it doesn't matter who's in the White House. If they're of the two principal parties, they're going to be playing the same games.
Well, because how can it be democracy if we are choosing the leader for them? If we're telling them, no, the candidate you voted for, you're not allowed to have him. No, we're going to put your Speaker of the House as president. That's the rightful president, because your Constitution says that if there's no sitting president, it must be the Speaker of the House. That would be like them trying to tell us that no, Donald Trump cannot be president. It has to be Nancy Pelosi, or no, it's illogical. And then they invite him to the summit of democracies. They're having an international meeting of all the democracies around the world. And then they're bringing somebody who's not even in the position. So let's just say they were correct. Let's just say, okay, he was supposed to be the rightful president because he was the Speaker of the House, blah, blah, blah. Well, he's not even that anymore. He's not even in their government anymore. So how could they bring him as the representative?
So his party, which ironically is called the Popular Will Party, Voluntad Popular, is one of the smallest parties in the opposition. This is before, suddenly, most Venezuelans never heard of him. But when they try to impose him as a dictator, they lost even more support. I'm sorry, as the new president, who really would have been a dictator. The Popular Will Party are like so small. Oh, yeah, that's another thing. They were changing turns, right? So they were giving each party a turn in the National Assembly to head the assembly. So it wasn't because of the amount of votes he had, because it happened to be his turn. And so when they were playing the coup against Maduro, he happened to be his turn. I'm pretty sure this was prearranged with the CIA. But long story short, he happened to be the head of the assembly at that point, and they tried to use that to impose him being president. But you know what I said the other day on Twitter when they were talking about the Summit of Democracy? I said, you mean the Summit for Prevention of Democracy, right? Because it's only the most right-wing, rigged, imposed dictators. And I'm so glad that Honduras is now to the left. But it's only those guys, the sellouts, they're the ones that are showing up for the summit. It's really to prevent democracy. But if you want to get into the elections, I can tell you real quick a figure. Out of 24 regions, as including the capital and all the municipalities, so Caracas and all the other municipalities throughout the country, the governorships, the mayorships, out of 24, only 3 of them went to the opposition. And so, and another thing, if it was all rigged and it's all rigged for Maduro, then he wouldn't have won them all. Or one of the ones that went to the opposition this time, which traditionally a Chavista area, is on the border with Colombia. And there is drug trafficking that they always try to bring through Venezuela that's blocked by the Venezuelan authorities, the border guards. But yeah, you think that if it was all rigged and Maduro thought, okay, let me just, give a couple regions over to the opposite, he wouldn't have picked that area. So this is
my thing is this. It's like, I don't know enough about the nitty gritty details of Venezuela's election process, their system itself. So I can't say 100% I think that everything they do in their election process is completely fair, because I don't think that about the United States. I don't think any country is perfect. But to me, it's like, I've seen no evidence that they're any less democratic than us or any other country that we claim to be a democracy. Because to me, it's like, what do the capitalists consider to be democracy? Because they're not talking about economic democracy. They're not talking about, democracy in the workplace. They're talking about political democracy. And in political democracy terms, Venezuela at least has elections, right? You at least can have elections. You can have multiple parties. You can participate. And that's what they consider democracy. Because I don't think in America we're democracy. Because in America, we have all the rich people who can fund all the parties, and we have all the rich people who control the process. I don't think we're a democracy, but we at least have the same sort of, okay, you can go to the ballot, you can do these things. And that's what Venezuela has, too. So it's like any complaint they would make against Venezuela, you could make that and more against the United States.
No, it's also important. Kobi, to recognize that in some ways they're even better than us and more transparent than us. How many
so?
international observers do we have in our midterms or presidential elections? Zero.
That's a good one. That's
we have some Americans that come and observe, but we never have our government invite international observers.
No, and even the people who observe it in America, like I think Pasta Jardula and Fiorella Isabel from the Convo Couch, I mean, they would be able to tell you all the semantical details of they don't let us stand in the room while they count the votes in certain areas, and there's all sorts of complaints they have about observing elections in America. But I want to get into the election itself.
By the way, Fiorella, I heard, was in Honduras observing there, so that's good. I didn't get to see her in Venezuela, but I want to tell you something real quick about a CNN journalist, Spanish journalist, CNN Español, when I was down at the arraignment, before I forget, at the arraignment for Assad. So, you know, I was in the elevator trying to go up to see the arraignment of Alex Saab, and all of a sudden we noticed a CNN Español journalist, and he didn't want to give his last name. I found out who he was later. But I told him, I was like, okay, you don't have to tell me your full name, but by the way, what do you think of the torture of Alex Saab? As soon as I said that, he shut up, and when the elevator doors opened, he went running. Yeah, and so I read his article.
He wants to talk about.
So hear me out. So I read his article. This is interesting. So this is how much of a sellout he was. He had a picture, you know, a really bad shot and like a mug shot or something of Alex Saab. He's very handsome, by the way. They make him look terrible because he's been tortured for months. Of course, he's going to look terrible. But you know, he's got a beautiful wife, beautiful family. He's a handsome guy. So they got like the ugliest picture they could find, right? And then under the picture, they put narcotraficante. Okay. Even though that's not a charge anymore. You understand what that means in English, that he's a narco trafficker. It's just racism. And this guy's Hispanic working for CNN Español. But this is how much of a sellout. Like nowhere in the article did they mention the old charge.
I don't know enough
word there to make him look bad, to taint it. You know what I mean?
Did they have anything? Like what makes them say that? Was there any sort of
No, there was nothing that made them say that in the article. But what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So what they have is they have one false witness so far that they supplied over the conspiracy to money launder. So that's clearly, you know, speculation. What's the legal term? Hearsay. So it's going to be some guy saying, oh, I hanged out one time with Alex Saab at a bar in, you know, I don't know, Barbados or something. And he told me he wanted to launder money. That's all they got. It's ridiculous. And the most he could, be sentenced for is 20 years, God forbid. But really, they're using Saab to try to pressure Maduro. They think Saab has some secret information. That's what they were trying to extract out of him when they tortured him. And he gave nothing. This man's a brave man. He's a hero. He saved millions of lives. And we need to fight for him, you know?
I mean, to me, and this is going to be a controversial take, a very, very controversial take, is that I don't think it's wrong for a country to try to evade sanctions. I don't think there's anything unjust about a country who's struggling to get food and medicines and other things in because of U.S. sanctions. I think they should violate the sanctions just because you're doing the right thing. You're feeding your people. This country is trying to prevent you from feeding your people. You're just doing what anybody would do.
The United States is breaking international law. The United States is breaking international law when it fights the sanctions. So if you're not following U.S. laws, so what? He hasn't sworn any loyalty to the United States, nor has Assange. But the U.S. empire thinks they're above the law because they're a member of the Security Council. So they think that they're untouchable, that they're immune from international law and the UN. That's why it's my view that the Security Council, the five powers that can always veto decisions and that are the untouchables, that should be abolished.
No, I completely agree.
The Security Council, and they know they can be fought for the International Criminal Court, then you'll start seeing the U.S. empire backing off on these persecutions.
I mean, I think the UN General Assembly should just be the Security Council because that's all of the countries in the world, because all states are sovereign and equal. There should not be 5 states above the other states in the world. Like, it just makes no sense because then you end up in a situation where, I don't know, anytime there's a vote about Israel, the U.S. will just veto it. And if the U.S. vetoes it, there's nothing that anybody can do about it. And then let's even portray it from the capitalist imperialist perspective. If there's something they want to bring up, Russia or China could just easily veto it. And there's nothing that anybody can do about it. Whereas if it's UN General Assembly, every country in the world being completely equal, I mean, then at least every country has an equal say. You have no dominating power over the other. And if you listen to what the Chinese government and the Russian government say about democracy and imperialism, there was a statement they put out last week where they specifically said that no country should be able to dominate other countries. That's inherently undemocratic. every country can do their own thing. Not democracy doesn't have to look the same in every single country. And so it's like, that's to push back on the idea that once China becomes the world's hegemon, they're going to be an imperialist power just like the U.S. If they're saying this now,
I don't think the Chinese invading Africa. Let me ask you a question. One thing's doing business with African countries, another thing's invading it like the U.S. does. So let me ask you a question. Do you know what leader a couple of years before they were deposed was actually advocating for an abolishing of the Security Council?
Who?
Gaddafi. And while I was in, Venezuela, I met with a Libyan comrade. You have people from throughout the world there, 400 international observers from Africa and Latin America, Canada, all over the world. And, so isn't that funny that like a couple of years before he happens to be deposed by the West, he's calling for an abolishing of the Security Council. But, that's what they do. That's what these coups, in the name of humanitarianism are really for. It's just to maintain the imperialist agenda.
I mean, John Bolton literally said with Venezuela, we want access to their oil.
And he admitted to trying to bring back the Monroe Doctrine. So for decades, the United States has distanced itself from the Monroe Doctrine. Oh, we never do that. And they're actually saying it. I couldn't believe it during the Trump regime. They said, yes, we want to bring back the Monroe Doctrine. So they were admitting what they were doing. At least they were less hypocritical to the Democrats in that regard.
Well, that's the thing. The Democrats do the exact same thing as the Republicans, but the Democrats hide it. Whereas, like with North Korea, for example, the U.S. or the Democrats and Republicans both don't like the government of North Korea. They both would like to get rid of it. While Democrats kind of play this game where it's like, we don't want to work with them until they do X, Y, and Z for us, and then maybe we will. And then the Trump administration actually has the negotiations, but then they say, oh, yeah, we want to do the Libya model. And the Libya model was literally where they convinced Gaddafi to give up his weapons of mass destruction, and then they overthrew him.
Yeah,
so if you're Kim Jong-un, why would you do that?
That really sends a strong message to the Iranians, doesn't it? I'll tell you this: if I was a politician in Iran, and somebody brought up in the parliament, we want to end our nuclear program, I say, are you nuts? Do you know what happened in Libya? So of course I get it. I mean, they're not going to make a bomb, but they want to have like a program still there, so that could be a diplomatic deterrence to be like, okay, don't invade us.
That's where I get torn in both directions, because it's like, to me, I want no nuclear weapons in the whole world. I want Russia, China, the U.S., all of us to get rid of our nuclear weapons.
Well, there's nuclear power plants in Germany and France. You can have power plants.
Power plants, yeah. What I'm saying is that I can understand why people want a deal with Iran to not have nuclear weapons, but to me, it's like, how could you not have a deal with Israel to get rid of their nuclear weapons? How could you? Because that's equal, right? Because they are two powers who are going against each other.
In a couple of years, the Saudis are going to have nukes. We know this. The Saudis are working with the Israelis to try to counter, Iranian influence. That's why they invaded and are now blockading Yemen. So pretty soon the Saudis are going to end up with a nuclear weapon. And I agree with you. When it comes to weaponry, we need to get rid of nukes altogether. I'm just saying that I can understand why there's a program in Iran, especially after what happened in Libya, because Gaddafi was trying to reconcile with the West, and then we saw how that worked out.
Oh yeah, completely. So let's talk about your experience though going to Venezuela. So let's start. What is the difference in your mind between an election observer and you were invited as what was it, a companion of the election?
Yeah.
So tell us
who invites what and what each thing represents. And if anybody has any questions for me in the chat in regards to the election, I'm free to, just like Venezuela's open and transparent, I'm going to be open and transparent about that as well. So there is an independent of the government, no matter who's in power, organization, that's the CNE. So there were CNE observers that were working for the opposition. And they were staying at a different hotel than us. Some of them came to lobby for events, and I overheard a couple people saying they were opposition in the lobby of the hotel where I was at. But I believe the people that were spending the night in the hotel were my people. We were of the international left, people from all over the world. And so we were invited by the political party, which is the Socialist Union Party, or Partido Socialista Unida, which is the ruling party. Maduro's party. It was Chavez's. Chavez founded it. And so as being invited by the ruling party, we were not actually technically election observers. When they gave us our credentials, we were acompañantes de elecciones, or election companions. And here's the difference. Certain bourgeois organizations, like from the EU, they tend to get invited by the CNE and sometimes by opposition parties. And, they like to try to meddle, which of course the Venezuelans don't tolerate. So when Venezuelans hear the word now observer, they think, oh, they're with them. They're trying to come and tell us what to do. And, whether you approve us or not, this is our system. And then the election companions are people from the international left that have a lot of respect for the autonomy of the Venezuelans and their rights. And we still observe, but we do it as companions of part of the process, not coming in from the outside to try to impose our way.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to point out that difference, because I know on face value, what some people might think is, oh, well, you were invited there by the Venezuelan government, so you must be biased. And those other election observers, they are truly neutral. And I'm here to say everybody's biased. I hate that idea that somebody could possibly be above bias.
Kobi, why do you think I changed majors? Why do you think I didn't pursue a journalism degree at grad school? Because I can't stand this whole objectivity thing. It's impossible that we as human beings can be unbiased on reporting on everything. That's why I'm going for history instead, and I want to show a history from the perspective of the oppressed. I don't hide that. Just like Howard Zinn, just like Michael Parenti, there's a tradition in the left of people entering history. I mean, Marx himself was an historian. Entering history to show the point of view of the oppressed that's often overlooked in the mainstream. And
that's why I didn't get into the journalism industry when I graduated with my bachelor's degree, because it was I don't want these corporate managers of these media companies telling me what I can and can't write, and they'll be telling me it as if what I wrote is subjective and what they're telling me to write is objective. But then to me, it's who decides what's objective? As long as what we're using is facts, because CNN will pretend, those media organizations will pretend, oh, we're fair and honest, we're neutral, we're just telling you how it is. But there's always an agenda there. They cannot be fair and neutral.
By the way,
there was possibly remove your bias from yourself.
There was a proving comrade at the hotel, and ironically, our hotel was owned by the EU. There was a logistical issue. We had to move to the EU hotel. It's called the Euro Building Hotel outside of Caracas. But there was an EU official in the elevator with a proving comrade that was telling me about. I don't remember exactly what he told him, but he ran out the door when the doors opened as well. A lot of the bourgeois like to prevent talking with working class people.
How could the EU?
Well, he said that it happened to me in Miami, and I told him the story I just told you. But yeah, the bourgeois like to go running and not actually talk to you when you're a working class person, especially on the left.
What's so frustrating to me is I understand. I think there should be election observers for any country's elections anywhere. I think it's a good thing to have election observers, whether we call them companions or observers. I think that's just semantical. But for people to pretend the EU sending observers is some sort of neutral situation in this case. Wasn't the EU involved in these sanctions on Venezuela? Wasn't the EU involved in trying to put Guaido in the presidency? So how are they neutral?
In the beginning, yes, but even opposition people that I spoke to that showed up at the voting booths, opposition candidates that were coming to vote that came out and were interviewed by us, they even said we're in a real democracy. So even the EU peoples are approving as observers this process. So these are people that are by no means Chavistas, that are independent of that. And they're also approving it. What was I going to say about the EU? Oh, yeah, the EU. So in the beginning, they supported the sanctions against Venezuela and the recognition of Guaido. They're kind of backing off on that now. Italy never went along with it. Italy had a very independent prime minister who said, no, we're not going to recognize Guaido. And he didn't do it for ideological purposes. That candidate was pretty much center-right. He did it because he's a nationalist and he doesn't believe he should have to go along with the U.S. empire wants. So more power to him.
Well, he doesn't want to violate the sovereignty of Venezuela because he doesn't want anybody violating the sovereignty of his country.
Right, which is logical. And also Spain currently are under the control of the bourgeois socialists. So these are not – I lived in Spain for a time. I'm very familiar with its politics. So Spain, you need to understand, there's a third party, which is kind of like the Green Party of the United States, but they have more power. And they're called Podemos. And they come out of the Indignado movement, which was during the Arab Spring, just before occupying the United States. They had massive protests in the streets of Madrid and Spain throughout. So they eventually formed their own party called Podemos, which means we can. And they've gotten a significant amount of power. They even had a vice president of the country at one point that was Podemos. But the point I'm trying to make is the current ruling party in Spain are bourgeois socialists. They're not part of Podemos. And they are still taking in exiles and terrorists, people who've committed acts of terror in Venezuela and protecting them. And Zapatero, I'm kind of upset with Zapatero right now. So when I was living in Spain, our prime minister was Zapatero. I would say he's a center-left guy. And I was very happy with Zapatero because even though he had issues with Chavez back then and is by no means a Chavista or like a working class socialist, you could say, I would say semi-bourgeois, Zapatero went and actually became an EU observer. And he proved it. So he went against his own party, against Sanchez and the bourgeois socialists, and said, guys, why are you still recognizing Guaido? I was there. I saw it. It's a democracy. So I'll give Zapatero credit for that. But I am upset with recent comments by Zapatero. He did not say that he was thinking the elections that I witnessed were not real. He didn't say that. But he said, oh, Venezuela needs to go back to Mexico and dialogue again with the opposition. Excuse me? How could you ask for such a thing? In the middle of the negotiations, they extradited Alex Saab. There was still a chance to free Alex Saab from Cape Verde and send him back to Venezuela. Then the negotiation would have went smoothly. But the United States knew what they were doing. They sabotaged the negotiations towards the end. Of course, what else could the Venezuelan government do? They had to stop them. They just extradited their guy. They were doing everything they could to try to stop it. So instead of Alex Saab, he's saying, oh, you need to go back to negotiation. Negotiate what? We just had the elections. All the parties took place. So that's realistic of him to say that, you know?
It reminds me of that quote. What's his name? Is it Hassan Ghanafani, from the Palestinian journalist from the 60s, 70s? He had said, you know, because somebody asked him, oh, why don't you guys talk? Why don't you have Palestinians and Israelis talk? And he says, what do you mean talk? That's the conversation between the head and the gun, right? Like, because I personally do think that some sort of, not a negotiation, because right, the Venezuelan elections are what determines who's in power, but dialogue is always good. I always think dialogue between the different parties is good. But at the same time, it's like, you can't expect dialogue when you're saying you're an illegitimate regime, and the only way that we will ever accept dialogue is if you get rid of your democratic elections and install somebody who didn't win them. Like, why doesn't Guaido just run in the next presidential elections, right? That would be the most democratic thing to do, right?
Run for president, Kobe. I'll tell you why. Because he knows he's not popular. He can't even show his face in his own party meetings. He can't even show up in the National Assembly. He was elected out. So, you know, he knows he can't run for president. That would just demonstrate he'd probably get less than 1%. You know what I mean?
Well, that's why they boycotted the elections, right? Because they didn't want to.
In the beginning, but not this time.
Why would you boycott an election you think you're going to win?
But Kobe, it's also important to understand that all opposition parties, including Voluntad Popular, including the party that used to be with Guaido, took part this time. All of them. And actually, the Communist Party of Venezuela doesn't work with Maduro's party anymore, but they didn't win any candidates. So the three regions that won are under the right wing. That's a fact. And something that they said in the youth group meeting, the Chavista youth that I met with, they're called Somos Venezuela. They appeared that picture that you showed. They mentioned that now we know what they're going to do. They're going to abandon the areas. They're going to go back to their mansions in Miami. And the state's going to have to step in, especially that region has a border with Colombia, for security purposes. So when they see that the opposition abandons them in a couple of years, they're going to vote back the Chavistas.
And so what did you do while you were there? Like, so you stayed at the hotel. What did you end up doing on election day? What did you see?
Yeah, so I got there on the 18th. Almost didn't make it. I missed my first flight. There was some logistical problems going through Santo Domingo, which I allude to in my blog. But when I finally got there on the 18th, very exciting getting to the hotel, and all these state security on motorcycles were stopping traffic so we get through, like, kind of in a motorcade, and the taxi driver, right? He was probably working for the state. Like, he was driving super fast. And it was me and a comrade from Argentina, this lady, and he was driving so fast. I even made a comment to him at one point, and I said, "This is una escena de James Bond." And he started laughing. I said, "This is like a scene from James Bond, like we're being chased or something." And so we finally got to the hotel, and the actual election day was a couple of days later on the 21st. And actually, most of the companions of the elections that I witnessed only on the bus, they only went on the bus once. They only saw 2 different voting centers. And they asked me, "So you want to go on a second bus and see a couple more?" I'm like, "Hell yeah." So I went to as many voting centers as I could, including opposition areas they brought us. They hid nothing from us. And
to me, it's like, so what did you see though? But before I go into what I was going to say, what did you go into the polling locations? Did you see, what's the process like? Do they have, because I know in Nicaragua, I interviewed Pasta about this. He talked about how in the voting location, you put your vote in, they have a voter roll, you get a thumbprint, like ink on your thumb, and then when they count the votes, they actually had a representative from each political party in the room, so that way none of the opposition parties in Nicaragua can say, "No, we were shut out of the process, we couldn't see it." So they had an election observer in every.
You had opposition members that were there at each voting booth. So it wasn't just people from the government, the ruling party that were there. But that's interesting. I didn't know Paso went to Nicaragua. I knew that Fiorello was on Honduras. I did talk to people
they both went to Nicaragua. All three, the whole Convo Couch crew did.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is I met a lot of people that had just come from the Nicaraguan elections to Venezuela. So I'm familiar with what happened there. And I'm very excited that Danielle was reelected, and I'm very excited that Xiomara Castro de Zelaya won. But anyways, we showed up at the voting centers. And actually, one of the things I witnessed that was very powerful is they had an old man with canes, not with canes, with crutches. He had to be assisted by crutches, and he had his family around him to bring him up so he could vote. But isn't that beautiful that they have volunteer voting there, and they so wanted to vote that they even brought their old grandfather out, and that was beautiful to witness.
Do you think there's any way that they could make it like so that disabled people can vote in a different way where they don't have to go out all that way?
The opposition always likes to try to find any little thing to say that they're rigging it, right? So that might have been something that was brought up in the dialogue, but imagining how the opposition is, they probably would have said, oh, because you're going to change the votes in the mail system or whatever. So it's really hard. But one of the deals they made with the opposition, this is interesting. So I always thought, not always, ever since I found out a few years ago, that they automatically audit the vote 30%, which is the highest in the world. I always thought, wow, they've kept up with 30%. Guess what? It's more than 50% now.
50% what? Say that again.
Audit. So there's always like a revote every time of a certain percentage of the votes. It used to be 30%, which is very high, very impressive. Now it's over 50%. And I'll tell you why. Officially, it's 50%. But technically, it's more like 54%. For example, they showed us that if there's like 7 voting tables that they have to check the votes on, they'll take 4. So it's actually more than half now, way higher than any other country in the world, based on their deal with the opposition.
Isn't it so ironic? I just had this thought. The idea that, because I understand the concerns people have. I personally have always liked mail-in voting, but Pasta does have a good point. A lot of people who complain, they have that same concern of you don't have what's it called, chain of command sort of thing. You don't have somebody. It could potentially get messed with in the middle because you don't have anybody necessarily seeing it. But isn't it ironic though that the opposition in Venezuela, who is supported by the Democrats in America, you would say that they would have that sort of complaint about not trusting a mail-in ballot process because it would be rigged. Whereas in America, Democrats are the ones who are most heavily pushing the idea of mail-in ballots, even though people have those sorts of concerns. I just thought it was interesting because it goes to show how.
Other examples that are going to blow your mind. So, for example, in the United States, you have those blue no matter who people, or just partisan people in general who I can't stand. And they'll go in. I mean, I remember when I was working for the Tim Canova campaign, when he was running as an independent once, I made a call and it really pissed me off. And I made a call to somebody. She said, oh, I already voted all blue. And I was like, so you already voted for Wasserman Schultz? And she's like, yeah. And I just hung up at that point. But I wanted to cuss her out. I just can't stand those people. I was with Stacey Abrams, literally, where she was saying Maduro was dictator. 2 days before I was going to go to Venezuela, I almost stood up and yelled at her. This is supposed to be
oh, I coughed. So if you were in Venezuela, you wouldn't do vote Maduro's party no matter who either, because it's about.
Well, let me explain why I'm bringing this up. Let me tie it to Venezuela, okay? So in Venezuela, when you go to a voting booth, they don't show you the political party of the candidate. But there's something that you have to also understand. You can talk to any Venezuelan on the street about Julian Assange, about Palestine, pick any topic anywhere in the world. They're the most educated, most aware, most informed people I ever encountered. And so these are people that know a lot about their candidates before they show up at the voting booth. So
I like that idea of not putting the party on it at all. Because I know personally.
That's more democratic, isn't it? Think about it.
Yeah,
you're not voting just on the party. You've studied about those candidates.
My mom has told me herself.
It's possible that an opportunist, Kobi, could have entered Maduro's party and they could be just a capitalist infiltrating the party. And you studied that candidate, you found dirt on them, then you don't vote for that section. You leave it blank if you're a Chavista, right? You don't want to vote for opposition either. So they get educated on the candidates beforehand. That actually is more democratic.
Yeah, I was going to say, in the U.S., my mom has said herself that in the past, she has just down ballot voted D because she didn't know who some of those lower ballot, local court, local.
I'm going to vote for a judge.
Didn't know who they were.
Who's nonpartisan because he's Hispanic. What if he's a right-wing Cuban? You shouldn't vote on identity.
Yeah. I completely agree. Totally don't vote blue no matter who. Totally not.
Nor
I mean,
just because their last name's Hispanic. You know, oh, I'm going to vote this judge because they're Latino like me. For all you know, they could be a right-wing Cuban or something. If you're aggressive.
Another example is like Baltimore. In 2020, Baltimore had a Green running for the city council in one of the races, Franca Mueller-Paz. I've interviewed her. She was out fundraising her Democratic opponent like 4 times. She raised like 4 times the amount of money he had. She was endorsed by the local DSA, the local Sunrise Movement, the local, even the AFL-CIO had endorsed the Green Party candidate. The Democrat didn't campaign. He didn't even go out in public and campaign. He was missing like meetings on the city council even, and he still won, I think, because people just see the ballot, oh, Democrat. Yeah, they just vote blue no matter who all the time. That's exactly how it happens.
I can't stand these people. I'm telling you. And so I was so happy to hear that when they told me that they don't show the parties. I was very impressed by that. And not only that, and I witnessed this with my own eyes. I remember hearing about it, but actually seeing it physically, it's very powerful. So when I got to the voting station, one of the first things I wanted to see was the printouts, right? Because you hear about, I mean, if you're educated about Venezuela, you hear about the famous printouts because most countries don't do this. So actually, so let me explain. So, you know, they actually showed what candidate you voted for. So you yourself can verify. And if you made a mistake, they'll go back and fix it for you. And so I actually saw where they printed it out, how they put it in. And I was very impressed by that. And I was so impressed by that. I told the lady that was working there, I said, you know, in the US, we don't even do that. But yeah, so you know, they're very transparent about how they go about it. People are educated on the candidates. You know, it was open. They didn't stop us from seeing anything. Like there was even an opposition guy that showed up and spoke to us that said, yes, we're in a democracy. And so really, you know, even the extremists from like Voluntad Popular, from, you know, Guaido's former party, you know, they even took part. So they themselves can't really call it a dictatorship, you know?
Well, because I think the opposition probably realized we can't really keep our charade going of not participating in elections and then calling ourselves democratic, because how are you democratic if you can't prove that you were the most popular in the country? I mean, you have to do that. Even in America, where I don't think our elections are fully democratic, I don't necessarily know if my vote's getting counted properly or whatever it is, but I still think we have to participate. Like, I understand people who don't vote or don't participate at all because of that, for that reasons. Totally logical. It's corrupt. I understand why you don't want to be involved, but you can't rule any country without elections. Like, we can't, it just wouldn't work. You can't, because even let's just say we have a revolution. Let's just say we have a revolution, we have a whole new country. You still have to have elections after that country is, like, you will not be able to maintain the power if you don't have some semblance of democracy.
This is how I define the U.S., Kobi, and you're free to disagree with me. I define the U.S. as a former bourgeois democracy that is now a corporatocracy. And so imperialism, which used to be the external arm of the United States, has now been brought in internally. So
I think it's always been that way, though. That, because to me, it's like worse now. It wasn't even democratic before. Like before the 60s.
Let me explain why it's worse now, and then you can if you disagree, that's fine. But let me just explain why I think it's worse in the last few years. You know, if you go, and there's always been poverty there, but I'm just saying, like, if you go to the countryside, Appalachia, right, that part of the U.S., you know, you go to a lot of the ghettos and the people of color and the working class or the poor in those areas, you know, especially with the pandemic as well, which has revealed the contradictions of capitalism. You know, you go to those areas and you see the results of internal imperialism. Go to a Native American reservation. I was in Standing Rock. You know, these are all a product of the imperialist system. So I've written, a book a few years ago, and I think now it's even more apparent than it was then. It's called The Living Contradiction, that focused on the internal imperialism of the United States. And it's getting worse day by day, in my view. And so often people see imperialism as the foreign policy of the United States. Yes, we have a terrible foreign policy. Yes, it stays the same or even gets worse, like it has under Biden, who's increased the sanctions against Cuba, made new sanctions against Nicaragua for practicing democracy. So, you know, yes, our external imperialism is bad, but internally here at home, we also have this. We have this common enemy, and we have to have this solidarity with Venezuela and their revolution.
Yeah, I think the only reason I disagree is just because, to me, I'd agree with you on the imperialism part. I agree with you on it coming home. I saw a statistic the other day that there's a city in Massachusetts somewhere where the highest income part of the city, the life expectancy is 90 years. The lowest life expectancy is like 50 or 60 years, like a third world country. But to me, it's like the only reason I say that we haven't gone from bourgeois democracy to, internal imperialism. The reason I think is it's just always been that way. Maybe not always the imperialism part, because it was Britain before us, but in terms of us not being fully democratic, if you look at the 60s, like there was riots in Chicago.
We never had a workers' democracy, by the way, Kobe. That's why I called it a bourgeois democracy.
Oh, yeah, but what I was saying is that we didn't even have that, because before the 60s, primaries, you had like maybe 5 or 10 states who would have a primary, and that primary meant nothing. Your primary was basically just the party leaders look at how people are voting, and then the party leaders decide for the party who's going to be the candidate.
Well, let me put it this way.
Let me finish. It took the riots in Chicago in like the 1968 in DNC. Those riots are what was necessary in order to even have a primary process. So basically what they were doing before the 60s was rigging every single primary. We didn't even have a bourgeois democracy until then. And then we still have no economic democracy whatsoever in the workplace. So it's like,
when it comes to economic democracy, you're right. But we've had some bourgeois political democracy. Let me explain why. So when the Constitution was first written, I agree with you. Think about it. When the Constitution was first written, it only represented 5% of the population. Women, Native Americans, former slaves, or slaves themselves, of course, African Americans, none of them had the right to vote. They had to fight for it. And so, yes, in the very beginning, it was like, for only 5% of the population, for the elites, if you owned land, if you were a Protestant white male, pretty much, that's how you were able to vote. So, that's why they interpreted differently, all equal under God, all of that was a fight of like, who's considered a full American, who's considered a full human being, which took, centuries to solve. The women didn't get the right to vote till 1920, for example.
Still happening in some ways.
After the Russians, right? Because of the Bolshevik Revolution, the women got the vote before us. But I think over time, come 1950s into the 60s, that there was kind of a bourgeois political democracy where people had some say. But I think the media has gotten so corrupt, so corporatized, that we're a full-blown corporatocracy now. We're a full-blown internal imperialist society. There's virtually no democracy left.
And I thought Julian Assange really proved that in 2016, what you're saying about it being a corporatocracy. Because I remember I woke up every morning at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. and I watched each and every single DNC leak that was coming out in 2016. And you would see how CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, literally any big name media outlet you can think of, they were collaborating with the Democratic Party. Like, how do we want to portray Bernie? How do we want to portray Hillary? How do we want to portray Trump? And so it's like, that was the moment to me that I woke up.
Trump more airtime than anybody, and he ends up winning, right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it was like, that was when I realized that journalism is all biased, because political journalism, because what, you can't be neutral in a case of oppression, right? If neutrality helps the oppressor. And so if you are being neutral, you're not being unbiased. You're being biased towards the oppressor. If you're being
the easiest political job I ever had, Kobe? I've been involved in politics for 20 years. My easiest political job was in Philadelphia in 2016, because the DNC, I was working with the Greens then, people were literally running into the arms of Jill Stein. Jill Stein shows up, she opens up her arms, hundreds of people from the Democratic Party, progressives, run into her arms because they were so pissed. I mean, we almost knocked down those gates. I was there pushing the gates,
I was probably, are you talking about at the convention in 2016?
Yeah, I was outside the convention.
I was there too, yeah.
And
I remember that.
And RT filmed me pushing the gates at that time. That was the first time I was on RT, and I went back on, a couple of years later. But one of the reasons why we're trying to push down the gates, not just because we're pissed that they rigged it against Bernie. I was with a group of Greens at those gates demanding the cops release Sherry Hunkala. They had detained her. She was bringing some food over to some Bernie delegates, and they were detaining her. And I wanted to get arrested with her, but she said, no, just stay out there and try to get the crowd with me. And I did. I got everybody riled up, and we started pushing down those gates. I was the guy who started that, actually.
Yeah, it was crazy. I was there with Democracy Spring, and we had, on the first day, I was there the first civil disobedience. I missed the next 2 or 3 they had done.
For those who don't know, she ran for vice president of the United States.
In 2012, right?
In 2012, you're right. In 2016, she introduced Baraka to Jill Stein. I know the whole story. But she's very heavily involved with the working class efforts of the Green Party in Philadelphia, and I'm a good friend of hers. So, yeah, she was there at the forefront at the DNC as well and was detained and was released later, but they stole, like, her contacts, her SIM card. Like, yeah, they gave her a hard time.
Yeah, I mean, the Green Party, and I think it's important that people pay more attention to the Green Party. And this is why I've started, it's learning about things like Venezuela. It's learning about things like U.S. imperialism.
By the way, Sherry Hunkala met Hugo Chavez. She actually went down to Venezuela and met him, and they organized a way to help poor Americans through Citgo, which of course has now been, taken by the Venezuelan government. And
what I was trying to say though is that it's so important. Like the reason I realized that it's so important to be green and to be so uncompromisingly green that I will not go to the Democrats at all because they will try to entice people away from the Greens back into the party. They'll try to co-opt us back. It was learning about us basically depriving people around the world of their democracy, similar to how they do it to us at home. That was when I realized, like, the Green Party, I should wear it as a badge of honor when people blame me for winning the election.
They try to blame you. It's like, how about your political message wasn't strong enough to get people to vote for you, and they started to vote for Joe Stein instead? How are you going to blame people for exercising the democratic rights? It's like blaming the Nicaraguans for the sanctions, the new sanctions now. Well, you voted for a party Biden doesn't like. I mean, apparently, their version of the American version of democracy now is you have to vote the candidate that the foreign leader of the U.S. empire wants you to vote for.
Well, it gets complicated because they're almost conflating. Like, I get it. There's political democracy on one hand, like the actual process of voting, but that's only one aspect of democracy. They're trying to basically make it so that any country who doesn't live up to our standards 100% should be overthrown. And it makes no sense because Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. They don't even pretend.
They don't even have elections. They're not even pretending to be democratic.
I was like, that's what confuses. That's what really opened my eyes about the contradictions in the Middle East, especially, is because it's like,
what percentage of the Colombian population now supports President Duque? Less than 1%. The entire country rose up against him. Guess who he blamed? Maduro. He said Maduro is behind all of this. He's conspiring against my government. It's like, I wish he was, right? But no, it's the Colombian people. They're fed up with his corruption and being a sellout to the U.S. Hopefully the left wins in Colombia, like they're rising up in other parts of the world, right? In Peru, in my father's country, hopefully soon Lula in Brazil. That'll really help the situation in Venezuela stabilize. But, the U.S. has literally stolen, oil, not only from Chevron, but stolen from, Iranian tankers that had oil that was bought by Venezuela that they tried to bring over. The Venezuelans are prevented from selling their own oil or refining it because of U.S. sanctions as well. International waters, like boarding these tankers and stealing their oil and then selling it. Trump, Biden, same thing. So, for example, the British, like with being complicit on Assange, they're being complicit now in stealing Venezuelan gold. They had Venezuelan gold deposits in the British bank. And they decided in the course not to give it to Guaido, but they're not giving it to Maduro either. They're holding on to themselves. So that's just another example of how these sanctions, they're trying to, subjugate the Venezuelan population.
I just don't understand how they get away with all this. Like, how can they support some dictators around the world, like literally support countries that are in no way democratic, don't even pretend to be democratic, and then other countries which are basically as democratic as you could expect, as democratic as we are, at least like on face value, they have elections where they can choose between opposition parties and whatnot. How can you support a dictatorship and then on the other hand, you're overthrowing that country's version of democracy? It just makes no sense. That's why I like what Russia and China say about dictatorship and democracy is also about international relations. It's also about, self-determination of the people in that territory. And we might not like who they've chosen as their leader. Maybe their process is flawed in some sort of way in any country. But every country has flaws in their process. Every country is going to have something that their government does that you're not going to like for whatever reason. And so to me, it's like, how can we tell them what to do and then still think of ourselves as being respecting the self-determination?
Also, FDR, Kobe, think of this, right? He's known as our most respected president. He made mistakes. He rounded up Japanese Americans and stuff. I'm not saying he's perfect, but he helped get us out of the Great Depression. He's recognized as probably our most respected president. How many times FDR elected? He died in office. He was elected 4 times. So later on, we changed how many times a president could be elected. So what? Everybody has to follow our model, even though public referendums in Nicaragua, Venezuela, etc., decided to let their presidents be reelected multiple times. They did it democratically. And like I said earlier, in case people are just coming on now, when former Chancellor Angela Merkel stepped down after being elected 4 times or being in office longer than Maduro has, nobody dared call her a dictator, right? And I told you that there's 2 reasons for that, in my opinion. 1, she's white. Number 2, she has an abundance of oil. That's really what it's coming down to. They want to turn, Venezuela into Iraq. They want to balkanize it. They want to split it up. They want to control its oil. But the Venezuelan people are united. They have militias. They have an army. They have a people united in their democratic process that I witnessed firsthand.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. It it really is, the racism thing plays a huge role in it, because it seems to always be in the global South, those governments where we think, no, their people don't know what they're doing. We need to tell them what to do. We need to tell them how to do it. Ignoring the fact that every human rights abuse that they commit, we also commit also. No, we need to tell them how to do it right. And it's just like, then you see, the Julian Assange case literally blows the whole door open on that situation, because it's like,
yep.
How can you claim to care about independent journalists in Nicaragua or in any other country when we're arresting Julian Assange, talking about shootouts on the streets of London, talking about possibly assassinating him?
Yes.
I mean, it's like, all for doing journalism, all for exposing the crimes of the U.S. empire.
You can't be a diplomat. You can't be a diplomat trying to save your people now, according to the U.S. standards. You can't be a journalist exposing war crimes according to U.S. standards. You can't be a human rights attorney like Steve Donziger, right? And who fought the Chevron in Ecuador without being imprisoned now. Because they always said, well, at least they're not Americans, right? He was an Australian, Saab is a Venezuelan national. No, now they're doing it against American people as well. It's a corporate prosecution. That's unprecedented, Kobi. You see how I'm saying it's getting worse? Because 20 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. Now we're so corporatized that we have a corporate private prosecution of an American lawyer. So there's no respect for anything now with this lawlessness of the U.S. empire. It has to be exposed.
I mean, that's why I think internationalism is so important. Not in terms of like totally respect sovereignty, do not overthrow foreign governments, do not sanction them like that. But to me, the idea of international collaboration, just having conversations with people in other countries and learning from their mistakes. And then even, because sometimes what people don't realize is that there might be people in that country that for some reason you don't like that country. There are people in that country who might agree with your struggle in your country, who might be more willing to help you with your struggle in your country than in your own. And not saying help in terms of overthrowing governments or anything like that, in terms of supporting your words, saying that you are telling the truth about this human rights abuse. You know, that's what's like so
one word
frustrating.
for that, Kobi: solidarity. Solidarity is a very powerful factor when it comes to internationalism. And we've gone over the hour mark. So if you want me to finish up,
any last words?
Yeah, I'll finish up something about Alex Saab. End it there and tell people how they can reach me. But yeah, so I was able to have the privilege to meet Camila Fabri de Saab, Alex Saab's wife, and she's advocating for his release, and she's protected by the Venezuelan government, and her husband is clearly a hero, saved millions of lives, and Wikipedia, last I checked, just a few days ago, says she lives in Russia. So for example, if I want to do a paper in grad school, I'm not allowed to cite Wikipedia. Because Wikipedia now, I mean, there's an internal war in Wikipedia for truth. There are some good Wikipedia editors, but they're not really getting the word out enough on Venezuela. But Wikipedia now is just propaganda. There's so many lies against Alex Saab there. They're not even being accurate about where his wife lives. They're using the whole like Russia menace thing. But yeah, going down there and seeing the truth was inspirational. You read my article in my blog about that. And I think more Americans, that really want to get the truth out should take part in trips like these for future elections, because Venezuela has a lot of elections. They're a very democratic country. And we need to continue to fight for all political prisoners of the U.S. empire, whether it's Donziger, Mumia, Saab, of course, and Assange. We have to continue to try to fight for their liberation, because if they're not free, then we're not free. So we have to continue to fight for freedom. And I hope that people can reach out to me on Twitter. I'm trying to build my army of truth there. I was censored about a year and a half ago on Facebook. So you can reach out to me there. Suarez, Suarez.
Yes, sir. I'll type it in the chat. So it's A-L Suarez.
Yeah, middle initial R. It shows it also for, like, my chat name here. So yeah.
Here, I'll just put it in the description after we're done with the video.
Just in case. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on today. It's interesting to hear from people who've actually been on the ground observing these elections. That's why I liked having Pasta on. That's why I liked having you on. These are perspectives that you don't hear on the mainstream media. They might bring on an EU election observer. They might bring on somebody from their own bias, but you will rarely see them bring on. Why don't you ever have people from Maduro's government on CNN debating with these people who are calling them undemocratic? Why don't we actually see an open dialogue between these different perspectives?
You know what I call them? The lamestream media. There you go,
I
Rick.
completely agree. Completely agree. But thank you so much for coming on. I gotta go. I got some work I have to do today too. But
My pleasure.
until next time, peace out, guys.